Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to rise this evening to speak to Bill C-20. I also think it's important that I mention that I'll be sharing my time with my honourable colleague from Laval. I believe I have his riding correct. It is late, so I want to make sure I do have that correct. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I think I need to begin my comments by strongly underscoring, Mr. Speaker, that New Democrats recognize the importance of trade to our economy. However, Mr. Speaker, we favour expanded trade opportunities and have a long record of supporting Canada's manufacturers and exporters in seeking new opportunities at home and abroad. But with that being said, Mr. Speaker, New Democrats would prefer to see increased trade with nations who respect Canadian values, particularly when it comes to the protection of human rights and safe working conditions. Further, Mr. Speaker, we believe that these trade agreements need to have clearly defined benefits to the Canadian economy, such as increased job growth here at home. New Democrats support a strategic trade policy where we restart multilateral negotiations and where we sign trade deals with developed countries that have high standards and with developing countries that are on a progressive trajectory. Countries like Japan, Brazil, South Africa, for example. These are countries that we should be signing free trade agreements with, not countries like Honduras, where drug traffickers operate with near impunity, human rights are regularly abused, democracy is under threat, and where there are very low labour and production standards that have the potential to hurt the Canadian economy in a race to the bottom for wages and workers' rights, Mr. Speaker. To be blunt, Honduras is a country with undemocratic practices, a corrupt government, weak institutions, low standards, insignificant strategic value, and a record of human rights abuses. NGOs have documented these serious human rights abuses, killings, arbitrary detentions of thousands of people, severe restrictions on public demonstrations, protest and freedom of expression, and interference in the independence of the judiciary are all well established. Here, Mr. Speaker, Transparency International ranks it as the most corrupt country in Central America and a major drug smuggling center with known linkages between the ruling party politicians, the police, and trafficking. Expert testimony at the Standing Committee on International Trade reinforced the concerns of New Democrats about human rights abuses in Honduras and substantiates our refusal to support an expanded trade agreement with a government that is directly involved in perpetrating these abuses against trade activists, journalists, and members of the LGBT community, Mr. Speaker. The Executive Director of PEN Canada stated, Mr. Speaker, quote, "Not only have Honduran institutions failed at protecting basic human rights for its citizens, there is a history of government involvement in these human rights abuses. Our research shows that the state not only failed to investigate crimes against journalists, but that in many cases, state actors were themselves complicit in these crimes." End of quote. Not only is the regime in Honduras a habitual offender of human rights, its policies have also almost exclusively sought to increase what is already the most centrified country in Latin America. Here, Dr. Rosemary Joyce, an internationally recognized Honduran expert and professor at Berkeley University, stated, and I'll quote again, Mr. Speaker, "Starting the very day of the coup in 2009 and continuing today, the most salient governmental issues have been the steps taken to enrich a small, wealthy elite at the expense of the majority of the Honduran population, leading to the highest level of inequality in Latin America." End quote. And finally, in June 2013, 24 U.S. senators signed a letter expressing concern about the human rights situation in Honduras and requesting that Secretary of State John Kerry make every reasonable effort to help ensure that Honduras's November 2013 elections are free, fair, and peaceful. Further, Mr. Speaker, 94 members of Congress have called on the U.S. State Department to halt all military aid to Honduras in light of its violent repression of political activity. So, Mr. Speaker, what we are seeing is a government steadfastly determined to enter in a trade agreement with a corrupt, abusive regime whose sole aim has been to enrich the small cadre of loyalists and friendly business elites at the expense of the remaining 99.9% of Honduran society. I strongly believe that entering into this agreement will only reinforce the stranglehold of the regime and is counter to the values which Canadians believe our government should be promoting abroad. Canadians expect our federal government to be a leader on the world stage, Mr. Speaker. That's why most Canadians agree that giving preferential trade terms to corrupt, undemocratic countries who suppress dissent, violate citizens' human rights, and facilitate drug trafficking is the wrong approach to trade policy. Let me reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that New Democrats recognize the importance of trade to our economy and that we favor expanded trade opportunities. But in determining our support for a trade deal, we also consider the fact that trade agreements must have clearly defined benefits to the Canadian economy. So let's look at the impact which the Canada-Honduras trade deal will have for the Canadian economy. Currently, Honduras accounts for less than 1% of our trade and is Canada's 104th largest export market in terms of value of exports. 2012 merchandise exports totaled a meager $38 million, while imports are $218 million, meaning there is already a significant trade deficit between our economies. Obviously, given these figures, Honduras is not a strategic trade partner. Therefore, a failure to ratify this agreement will not have an adverse impact on the Canadian economy, while the ratification of the agreement will have no discernible impact on Canadian exporters. What is my time, Mr. Speaker? 3 minutes? Thank you. Since the Conservatives took power, Mr. Speaker, Canada's export performance has suffered badly, going from a significant trade surplus to a huge deficit. My Conservative colleagues often brag about the number of agreements that it has signed, but the fact is that it has not finalized even one agreement with a major market that would offer significant benefits for Canadians. In fact, leaked reports from the Department of Foreign Affairs reveal the Conservatives' pursuit of insignificant agreements like this one with Honduras has tied up resources and compromised Canada's ability to secure agreements with high-standard economies that offer real opportunities, like Japan, for example. This speaks directly, Mr. Speaker, to the Conservatives' record on trade. When they came to power, they inherited a current account surplus of $18 billion, but 8 years later, Canada's current account deficit stands at $62 billion, representing a negative swing of $80 billion and an average decline of $10 billion a year. Canada's trade record vis-à-vis our international counterparts emphasizes the failure of the Conservative government to increase export-driven trade, historically a key driver of our economy. Here, between 2006 and 2012, Canada had the worst current accounting performance when comparing our trade performance to 17 other countries around the world, Mr. Speaker. While the Conservatives continue to chastise the NDP's position on supporting balanced, mutually beneficial trade agreements, their record on trade, just like their record on so many other important economic files, speaks for itself, Mr. Speaker. So in conclusion, I believe this is the wrong trade deal at the wrong time. Honduras's record on human rights is atrocious, its leadership is corrupt, and continues to use the country's public institutions to benefit a select few. And there is no significant advantage for the Canadian economy in signing this deal. Instead of focusing on marginal trade deals like this one, we should be looking to strengthening our trading relationship with economies that can offer real benefits to Canada in both terms of cheaper imports, but also increased exports of manufactured goods and not just raw materials. That's why I will continue to oppose this bill in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.